Mr. President, I rise today to call up Portman Amendment number 3.
The clerk will report the amendment.
The senator from Ohio, Mr. Portman, for himself and Mrs. Shaheen, proposes an amendment number 3 to amendment number 2. After Section 2, insert the following.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be disposed of.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to thank Senator Murkowski for giving me this opportunity today. She talked earlier about the fact that we're going to talk about Keystone in an open process, meaning we're going to allow amendments, which would seem sort of normal, but around here it hasn't been over the last several years. And this amendment is one that relates to energy efficiency. I strongly support the underlying bill, and we'll talk about it in a moment. But I also support the strategy of saying let's produce more energy, but let's also use the energy that we have more efficiently. I believe those are complementary, and I believe it's consistent with creating more jobs in this country, making our businesses more competitive, and improving the environment. So I appreciate her willingness to allow us to move forward with this amendment today. This energy efficiency amendment we're talking about is a key part of this all of the above energy strategy that a lot of us discuss, whether it's nuclear or renewables or coal or oil or gas. Efficiency ought to be part of it. It's an amendment that's the result of a lot of years of work of Senator Shaheen, who was mentioned earlier, myself, but also Senator Hoeven, Senator Ayotte, Senator Franken, many others in this body. Our co-sponsors as of this afternoon are Senator Shaheen, Senator Ayotte, Senator Bennett, Senator Collins, Senator Gardner, Senator Manchin. And this is legislation that is clearly bipartisan and legislation that really shouldn't be controversial. It takes part of the broader Shaheen-Portman, Portman-Shaheen legislation that has already passed the House of Representatives and brings it to the floor. This is also legislation that has passed the committees in the Senate and the committees in the House, energy committees, with wide bipartisan margins, and actually was on the floor of the House last year and passed with a vote of 375 to 36, including with the support of the President of the Senate today. Thank you, Mr. President. But it's 4 provisions, and they're all pretty straightforward. None of them has a mandate. None of them is a coster. The CBO, Congressional Budget Office, has told us that they don't score. All of them are voluntary. The first one is kind of an important one. It's called Tenant Star. It establishes a voluntary market-driven approach to trying to align the interests of commercial building owners and their tenants. And this is important because a lot of the real estate folks out there would like to have this ability to say, this has the housekeeping seal of approval. You know, it's like a Energy Star seal of approval that enables people to know this is an energy efficient building. This is broadly supported in part because it is voluntary. It is not a mandate, but it will help a lot in terms of reducing energy consumption. The second provision is one that's very timely. This is one that a lot of us have worked on over the years. Senator Hoeven has been out talking about this. We talk sometimes in this place about the unintended consequences of regulations. This would be a great example of that. Here you have the Department of Energy promoting a regulation that, if we don't stop it now, will actually make our country less energy efficient. It's unintended, perhaps, but it's something that we need to deal with legislatively and deal with now. And if we don't, then we're not going to be able to help save these particular products, which are water heaters. Around the country, there are hundreds of electric cooperatives that operate voluntary programs that use what are called electric resistance water heaters. And they use them to store energy at night. And then during peak demand period, they don't have to turn these electric water heaters on. So it's actually an energy efficiency effort. It's the kind of grassroots, on-the-ground innovation we want to see more of. But this regulation that we have to stop from the Department of Energy establishes a new standard for water heaters that effectively undermines this program. How? Because it makes it impossible for companies to produce these kind of water heaters that the co-ops are using. So the legislation exempts these water heaters from these new standards, allowing these co-op programs that are good for energy efficiency to continue. You've probably heard from your electric rural co-op if you're a member of this body on this issue, because it's very important to them that this be handled and handled now. If it is not, then these companies will stop producing these water heaters and they won't be able to continue these programs. The third provision has to do with the federal government. And basically it says that the federal government ought to practice what it preaches. You know, the federal government talks a lot about energy efficiency, and yet it's probably the biggest energy user in the world and probably one of the most inefficient. This says simply that federal agencies have to coordinate with the Office of Management and Budget, with Department of Energy, and with the Environmental Protection Agency to develop an implementation strategy that includes best practices, measurements, and verifications for the maintenance, purchase, and use of energy-efficient and energy-saving information technologies. IT has been a source of great inefficiency in the federal government, and this legislation simply says, let's require these federal agencies to actually clean up their act to be able to be more energy efficient in the area of information technologies. Again, it's a nonpartisan approach. It's one that's been supported by both sides of the aisle. Finally, along the same lines, the fourth provision requires that federally leased buildings without Energy Star labels benchmark and disclose their energy usage data. So again, these are not federal buildings that have to report this information, but these are buildings that the federal government leases. So in effect, all of us as taxpayers should have an interest in being sure that these leased buildings also have the energy efficiency provisions to avoid wasting taxpayer money. So I think these are really important provisions. These are really not controversial provisions. I think they're consistent, again, with this idea that, yeah, let's produce more energy. Let's be sure we have the infrastructure to bring the energy to the consumer, but let's do it in a way where we are using more energy, but also using it more efficiently. I hope we'll see the kind of strong bipartisan support here on the floor that we've seen in the past on these provisions as they're part of this underlying legislation. I'd like to talk, if I could, for a moment, Mr. President, about the underlying legislation. This is the Keystone XL pipeline construction. Seems like we've been talking about this forever. And frankly, we have. This has been going on for almost 7 years now, I believe. Think about that. This is just to get the approval of the pipeline, not to actually build it. Just to get the approval, it's taken almost 7 years. It's time to stop talking about it and to move forward on it. The Keystone XL pipeline has taken almost 7 years. By comparison, we built the Hoover Dam in less than 5 years. The entire Empire State Building was constructed in 1 year and 45 days. In fact, the entire Transcontinental Railroad was constructed by hand in 6 years. So there's no reason we shouldn't move ahead with this. We've learned a thing or two about this Keystone XL pipeline during this period of time when we've been debating it. And everything we learned, I think, leads us to a conclusion that this just makes sense to move forward. We know we can do it safely. We know we can do it in an environmentally sound way. We know we can create thousands of good jobs during its construction. And yet, as we stand here today with the Keystone XL pipeline a source of debate rather than a source of jobs, we're not moving the country forward. I think we've waited long enough. There's been debate on the floor. I've heard it over the last couple days and last week. Is this going to create jobs? Yeah, it will. The State Department has said it will, and the State Department is in the Obama administration, and they're the ones that tell us that it's going to increase our economy by about $3 billion, increase the GDP of America, but also create more than 40,000 jobs during its construction, both through the actual building of the pipeline and through the sourcing of pipeline projects to American manufacturers. By the way, a bunch of those manufacturers in my home state of Ohio. Ohio produces pipe. Ohio produces the kind of steel that goes into the structural steel that goes into the construction of the pipeline. Ohio also produces the monitors that go on this pipeline. We also produce other things like pumps and compressors. So this will create jobs in my home state of Ohio. And I've toured these factories. I've talked to these workers who are going to have the opportunity now to roll that steel, build these compressors, and so on. And for them, this is important too. Some of the critics of the pipeline have attempted to undermine these numbers by claiming the jobs related to the pipeline are not permanent. I don't know what to say about that, except that are any construction jobs permanent by that definition? We certainly want construction jobs. I mean, this administration, the Obama administration, talks all the time about the need for more infrastructure projects to create more jobs. This is an infrastructure project. By some measure, it may be the biggest infrastructure project in America over the next couple of years if we approve this thing. It will create not just jobs, but good jobs. This is the kind of work that we want to have more of in this country. This is why a lot of the labor unions, including the building trades, are excited about this, because they know it's going to be able to lower that unemployment, to be able to get people back to work who have lost their jobs. Others have expressed environmental concerns. Let's look at the facts. Let's look at the science. Every environmental study that's been conducted, the pipeline is passed. In fact, we know the pipeline is safer and more environmentally sound than the alternative. What's the alternative? It's what's happening now. It's transporting this oil by truck, transporting this oil by train. As we know, and as CRS report has said, a lot of this oil actually doesn't even come from Canada. It comes from the Bakken. The Bakken is actually in America. It's in North Dakota and other places. And so some of that oil is now being moved by truck and by train. Better that it go by pipeline. It's more efficient, of course, less costly, but it's also safer environmentally. Let's debate this issue, and I'm happy to do that, but let's try to stick to the facts. And the fact is, this thing just makes sense. For those who oppose it, I would ask them, why is it so different than all the other pipelines we've constructed in this country? I mean, in all of our states, we have pipelines. When we build this, we won't be the first. It won't be the first pipeline to carry oil across international boundaries, by the way. It won't be the second either, or the third. It'll actually be the 20th pipeline to carry energy across the international boundary. It'll be the fourth one to import oil, specifically oil from Canada. Just to give you some idea of how the permitting process of XL has been, of the 3 other Canadian pipelines that have been approved, it took the federal government 15 months on one, another 24 months, another 28 months. The permitting process for this one, Keystone XL, has now dragged on for over 76 months and counting. So, look, I've heard people on the floor say, what's the rush? Why are we rushing this? I don't think we're rushing. I think this makes sense, just as we've approved other pipelines, to go through a process and now to have the ability to move forward with these jobs and this energy security that it provides. And by the way, when this debate's over, we also need to think about our permitting system. To me, this is really an indictment of our entire permitting system in this country. We need to do something about it, where you simply can't get a project approved. And by the way, I'm not just talking about oil and gas projects. I'm talking about other energy projects, solar projects. I'm talking about siting windmills. I'm talking about hydro projects. I first got involved in this issue because there was a hydro project on the Ohio River, of all places, that was being held up by federal regulations. And the folks who were trying to get this through came to me and said, we can't believe how complicated it is to get a permit from the federal government. As soon as we get one permit from one agency, another agency comes in, they require it that it be done sequentially. And it's taken us forever, and we're losing investors. And those investors are going not just across the Ohio River to another state, they're going to another country because the federal permitting system is so bad in this country. That's why I've introduced bipartisan legislation called the Federal Permitting Improvement Act. Senator McCaskill from Missouri is my co-sponsor. We're hoping to bring that to the floor very soon, too, because the American government shouldn't be standing in the way of good projects, particularly these energy projects that are so important. The American government shouldn't be standing in the way of good American jobs. And that's exactly what's happening. We need to streamline the approval process, and it can be done, and it can be done in a bipartisan way. So it comes down to this. We hear a lot about an all-of-the-above energy strategy here in the Senate. Everybody seems to be for it. It's a position the American people support, by the way, overwhelmingly. I've been to the floor many times to express my support for an energy policy that includes everything from nuclear to oil, natural gas, renewables, coal, and of course, increased energy efficiency, as we talked about earlier. And we'll need all of those if we want to continue to see energy prices fall and continue to see our reliance on dangerous and unstable parts of the world decline. But an all-of-the-above energy strategy includes the Keystone Pipeline and other projects like it. So if you want to be able to say you support all of the above, you better support Keystone. If you don't support the pipeline, I think you have to explain to the American people why you stood in the way of 40,000 good-paying jobs, why you opposed a project that was more environmentally safe than the alternatives out there now, and you have to explain why you oppose an all-of-the-above energy strategy that can keep prices low and help secure North American energy independence, which also affects our national security. For us not to be dependent on these volatile and dangerous parts of the world is good for our national security. Let's stop sending the money to the Mideast. Let's keep the money right here in North America. And let's stop the delay. Let's make construction of this pipeline a reality. American people are watching. We've all spent time in our states over the last month. We've all heard over and over again that the American people want us to work together. They want us to cooperate where we can, particularly on issues that relate to jobs and the economy and getting things moving in this country. I think this current legislation can be a model for how the Senate can operate, and a sign that we've heard the message the voters sent in November. This final bill will be the process, as I said earlier, of an open process where people will be able to come out on this floor and debate, as I have today, not just on the underlying legislation, but on the amendments on energy efficiency. That's good. At the end of this process, it will likely contain some policies that I fully support. And by the way, the final bill will probably contain some policies I don't support, because that's what happens when you have an open process. People will be able to come out here, make their best argument, and people will vote yay or nay, depending on how they feel it affects them, their states, and their constituents. That's what's happening here on the Senate floor, and that's a good thing for our country, and it's a good thing for getting to the right policy. When the amendment process is complete, I believe we will have produced a bill that advances this goal of implementing a true all-of-the-above energy policy while creating more jobs, for the American people and protecting our environment in better ways. That's what we all want, and I think that's why this legislation is a win for all Americans. Madam President, I yield back my time.